Good evening, everyone. I'm glad to be able to be with you at least virtually, even though I can't be with you physically. I'm feeling mostly better, still a little bit under the weather, but I wanted to record this video so that we could conclude our study in Judges and not having it hanging for the summer. So we have a lot to cover today, but why don't we go ahead and start with some prayer. Most gracious Heavenly Father, we just thank you for this day and this chance to look at your word. I pray that as we look into these chapters and Judges, that you would just reveal your truth to us and just speak into our hearts. In Jesus' name, amen. So before we start, let me just start off this by saying, obviously, this is a little bit different format than normal. We can't have questions and response because this is all pre-recorded. But what I'm going to be doing is I'm just going to be kind of reading and walking through these last few chapters in the book of Judges. And so I appreciate your patience with it, and hopefully it'll be helpful to you. And yeah, so let's go ahead and get started. Well, actually, before we get started, I want to say these are some of the darkest passages, I think, in all of Scripture, really, because they tell of a time that is where people are just doing things that are really crazy and not good. And it's easy to read these and think like, why are they here? You don't hear sermons preached about them. When you read them, you kind of go over them. I remember one time actually in college, I was in a small group with my pastor at the time, and I actually approached him in one of our small groups, and I was like, what are these passages for? Why do they even exist? And he actually wasn't super familiar with them, but I actually appreciate his response, because what he did is he went to the very last verse in the book of Judges, which is the one we've been going to many times, and it says, "In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes." And I think that's really key to understanding all these passages, and it's repeated several times in here, because I think it's telling us that, Israel was really, we talked about how it's been a slow and steady decline, right? How at the beginning things seemed to be going well, and then every subsequent judge got worse and worse, and then we ended with Samson was our last judge, and there was a lot of questionable things on Samson's part. But now we get into this passage where there are no judges. And in fact, the enemy is within. It's Israel itself is the problem. And in these chapters, we're going to see some of how this plays out. But I think it's really important to keep this in mind, that everyone was doing what was right in their own eyes. And we're going to see how this, I think, applies to even our situations today. So we're going to start in Judges chapter 17, and it says this. There was a man of the hill country of Ephraim whose name was Micah. And he said to his mother, "The 1,100 pieces of silver that were taken from you, about which you uttered a curse, and also spoke it to my ears, behold, the silver is with me. I took it." And his mother said, "Blessed be my son by the Lord." And he restored the 1,100 pieces of silver to his mother. And his mother said, "I dedicate the silver to the Lord from my hand for my son, to make a carved image and a metal image. Now therefore I will restore it to you." And so when he restored the money to his mother took 200 pieces of silver and gave it to the silversmith, who made it into a carved image and a metal image. And it was in the house of Micah. And the man Micah had a shrine. He made an ephod and the household god, and ordained one of his sons, who became his priest. In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Okay, so we see here at the start of our story a bunch of interesting stuff right off the bat. In the first few verses, we see that there's this guy, Micah, in the hill country of Ephraim, and he had stolen 1,100 pieces of silver from his mother. Now, this is a very large quantity of silver, and he had stolen it even before the start of this narrative. And it's interesting because he's giving it back, but it almost seems like the reason he's giving it back, because his mother was unable to find who stole the silver from him. So she curses. She's like, apparently she cursed whoever happened to steal the silver, and he heard about this curse, or he heard her speaking this curse, and was like, "I don't want to be cursed. Hey, Mom, I did it. Here's the silver." And So he's already a very questionable moral judgment, right? Somebody who stole from his own mother and hid it from her. But then he confesses it, and his mother's reaction is the one that seems good. She says, "Blessed be my son by the Lord." So in many ways, it's almost like she's retracting the curse and say, "I don't want to curse you, but instead, I'm going to bless you." But then things take a turn for the worse. As it already started off bad, now it's going to get worse. So basically, the mother says, "I'm going to dedicate this silver to the Lord now that I've received it back." Which that seems good. But what does she do when she dedicates it to the Lord? She gives a portion of it, 200 pieces of silver, back to Micah to say, let's make an idol out of this. And so that's what she does. Now, this leaves a few questions. One, what about the other 900 pieces of silver? Where did that go? Presumably, maybe she kept it for herself. We don't know. It doesn't really give the answer. The other question is... obviously, the Bible is very clear. You're not supposed to make idols. You're not supposed to make carved images. But apparently, Micah and his mother just didn't really... They either were completely ignorant or they were willfully ignoring that command. And so they made idols out of it. Now, these idols most likely were idols to Yahweh. Remember that even though... they were making idols, they still seemed to be trying to worship the Lord. So this was not them going after foreign gods. This was worshiping God in an improper way. And this improper way of worshiping God continues when Micah, instead of in just making an idol and bowing down to it, he actually starts to establish his own priesthood almost. So what he does is he makes an ephod, it says, a little shrine and an ephod. Now a shrine obviously is a little place with an idol to worship. An ephod is, there was the officially sanctioned ephod with the tabernacle where God said that he would use it to give guidance, and this is what the priest wore, and it had these little things that you would cast lots and God would use them to speak through them and through the priesthood. But Micah here is making his own, and yeah, so that's not exactly what God wants to happen. And then it says he ordains his son to become his priest. So basically, he is setting up his own Yahweh worship outside of the official Yahweh worship that is ordained in the Bible. And now you might be asking, well, why would he do this? Well, I think he wanted, a God that he could worship at home. He wanted the divine blessings that God would come with worshiping God. And I think it's showing a mixture of ignorance as well as adopting local customs, because this was not at all uncommon of what people in the ancient Near East would do. They would set up their own personal shrines and pray to their gods and hope that their gods would bless them. So this is what he's doing in his own house. And this is why verse 6 is so important when it says, in those days there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. He's basically, his mom's doing what she thinks is best, he's doing what he thinks is best, even though it's directly going against what God wants. And this says, now there was a young man of Bethlehem in Judah, of the family of Judah, who was a Levite, and he sojourned there. And the man departed from the town of Bethlehem in Judah to sojourn where he could find a place. As he journeyed, he came to the hill country of Ephraim, to the house of Micah. And Micah said to him, where do you come from? And he said to him, I am a Levite of Bethlehem in Judah, and I'm going to sojourn where I find a place. And Micah said to him, stay with me, and be to me a father and a priest, and I will give you 10 pieces of silver a year, and a suit of clothes and your living. And the Levite went in, and the Levite was content to dwell with the man, and the young man became to him like one of his sons. And Micah ordained the Levite, and the young man became his priest, and was in the house of Micah. And then Micah said, now I know that the Lord will prosper me because I have a Levite as a priest. So a Levite comes along, and now Micah, he takes advantage of this opportunity. He's thinking, you know what, I ordained my son as a priest, but, he presumably has some knowledge of what God's commanded, as the Levites are supposed to be the priests. And so he's thinking, this guy's a Levite. This guy's got an inroad to God. And so he he offers him a sweet deal, and he says, you know what, you just be a priest for me and my family, I'll give you clothing and money, and it'll all work out. And the Levite's like, I have nowhere else to be. He kind of didn't have any plans. He's like, hey, this could work out well for me. So he stays there, and they're happy. Now, excuse me, a few things about this that are a little odd. You might be thinking, well, why what about the son, right? The son who was kind of kicked out. There's nothing really said of him. And the other thing is, he says, now I know that the Lord will prosper me because I have a Levite as a priest. So he's still thinking of, different ways to help God bless him. He's thinking, if I set up a shrine, if I worship God, and if I make this idol and worship him. Now, at first you might have been thinking, well, am I really legitimate? I don't know. I'm kind of doing this my own way. But now a Levite comes into the picture, and he's thinking, hey, if I get a Levite to come and be my priest, then things are going to even go better. Now, what's interesting in all this is, obviously, this is not at all in line with how God is calling his people to worship him. Yet he is allowing this to exist and allowing this to even prosper, right? It seems like things are going well for Micah. But there's going to be a turn here, and the tribe of Dan's going to show up. And it's not... Again, the interesting thing about these stories is there's not going to be any heroes in them. Every character is just as bad as pretty much any other character in these stories, and we're going to see how this plays out. Okay, so it says, continuing in chapter 18, in those days there was no king in Israel. And again, it's reminding us that everyone's doing what's right in their own eyes. And in those days, the tribe of the people of Dan were seeking for itself an inheritance to dwell in, for until then, no inheritance among the tribes of Israel had fallen to them. Okay, so the people of Dan, it mentioned in way back in chapter 1, that they were having trouble coming into the land that God had promised them, and they were actually, they were hiding and running in fear. And in fact, it says the Amorites pressed the people of Dan back into the hill country, for they did not allow them to come into the plain. How the people of Dan weren't able to conquer the land that they were allotted to. And so now they're still looking for this place, and now, chronologically, these chapters might not actually be after Samson. They might have been a little bit earlier, but they're telling of the fulfillment of the Canaanization of Israel, and how they are the kind of the fulfillment of the deterioration of the core of what Israel is. Anyway, so Dan is looking for a place to settle. And so in verse 2 it says, so the people of Dan sent 5 able men from their whole number of their tribe, from Zorah and from Eshtaol, to spy out the land and to explore it. And they said to them, go and explore the land. They came to the hill country of Ephraim, to the house of Micah, and lodged there. And when they were by the house of Micah, they recognized the voice of a young Levite. And they turned to him and said, who brought you here? What are you doing in this place? What is your business here? And he said to them, this is how Micah dealt with me. He has hired me, and I have become his priest. And they said to him, inquire of God, please, that we may know whether the journey which we are setting out will succeed. And the priest said to them, go in peace. Your journey on which you go is under the eye of the Lord. Okay, there's a few odd things here. So the tribe of Dan is sending these people out to scout, which again is a little odd because they've been in the land for a long time. It's like, why are they moving now? Well, we're not sure, but they are moving, and then they come across this Micah and the Levite, and their initial reaction is, what are you doing here? Which is an appropriate reaction, because again, the Levite shouldn't be ministering to this people in this way, because that's not what God has commanded. But instead of rebuking him or saying, is this what God wanted? No, they inquire of him and say, oh, a Levite, maybe you can tell us if our mission will be successful. Inquire of God. And the priest says, go in peace. The journey is under the eyes of the Lord. And we don't know how he got this message, or even if it's necessarily authentic, but it seems to be a blessing. And then the 5 men departed and came to Laish, and saw the people who were there, and how they lived in security, after the manner of the Sidonians, quiet and unsuspecting, lacking nothing that is in the earth, and possessing wealth, and how they were far from the Sidonians, and had no dwellings with anyone. And when they came to their brothers at Zorah and Eshtaol, their brothers said to them, What is your report? What do you report? And they said, Arise, and let us go up against him, for we have seen the land, and behold, it is very good. And will you do nothing? Do not be slow to go and enter and possess the land. As soon as you go, you will come to an unsuspecting people. The land is spacious, for God has given it into your hands, a place where there is no lack of anything that is in the earth. So 600 men from the tribe of Dan, armed with weapons of war, set out from Zorah and Eshtaol, and they went up and encamped at Kiriath Jearim in Judah. On this account, that place is called Manalah Dan to this day, and behold, it is west of Kiriath Jearim. And they passed on from there to the hill country of Ephraim, and came to the house of Micah. And then the 5 men who had gone to scout out the country of Laish said to their brothers, Do you know that in this house there is an ephod, household gods, a carved image, and a metal image? Now therefore consider what you will do. And they turned aside there, and came to the house of the young Levite at the home of Micah, and asked him about his welfare. Now the 600 men of the Danites, armed with their weapons of war, stood by the entrance of the gate. And the 5 men who had gone to scout out the land went up and entered, and took the carved image, the ephod, the household gods, and the metal image, while the priest stood by the entrance of the gate with the 600 men armed with weapons of war. And when they went into Micah's house and took the carved image, the ephod, the household gods, and the metal image, the priest said to them, What are you doing? And they said to him, Keep quiet, and put your hand on your mouth, and come with us to be as a father and a priest. Is it better for you to be a priest to the house of one man, or to be a priest to the tribe of a whole clan of Israel? And the priest's heart was glad, and he took the ephod and the household gods and the carved image, and went along with the people. So they turned and departed, putting the little ones and the livestock and the goods in front of them. Okay, so we see here, so the tribe of Dan, they say, let's go and conquer this land. And as they're going along, they get to Micah's house. And so these 600 men armed for war, they're like, the 5 men are like, hey, look, remember there's some idols over there and a household ephod. Let's go and grab them. So they go and grab them, and they make a proposal. The priest is like, what are you doing? They make a proposal to him. They're like, hey, wouldn't it be better to serve as our priest than to serve as a priest of a single man's household? And he says, hey, that's a good idea. And so he leaves. And so we see a bunch of things going on here. One, the Danites are very much complicit, and they're stealing from Micah. But what they're stealing is improper gods and an improper, really, cult rituals here, that they're getting further and further away from what God has commanded them to do. We also see that this priest is not very loyal. He immediately turns side and goes along with the people. And then let's see what happens. And it says, when they had gone a distance from the home of Micah, the men who were in the houses near Micah were called out, and they overtook the people of Dan, and they shouted to the people of Dan, and turned around and said to Micah, what is the matter with you that you come with such a company? And he said, you take my gods that I made and the priest, and go away, and what have I left? How then do you ask me, what is the matter with you? And the people of Dan said to him, do not let your voice be heard among us, lest angry fellows fall upon you, and you lose your life with the lives of your household. And then the people of Dan went their way, and when Micah saw that they were too strong for him, he turned and went back to his home. So Micah, when he finds that he's been robbed, he gets his neighbors, and he gets together a little fighting force, and they go and chase the people down. And when he shows up, they turn to Micah and say, what's the matter? Why are you coming after us? And he says, you've taken my this is really interesting. He says, you take my gods that I made and the priest, and go away. What have I left? It's interesting. He's acknowledging that these gods are the gods that he has made, that they're not the true God. Obviously, he thinks they are symbolic of the true God, but he's gravely mistaken. The people of Dan reply to him, don't let your voice be heard, lest angry fellows fall among you, and you lose your life with the lives of your household. Basically, they're kind of tongue-in-cheek here. They're saying, hey, don't speak loudly, or some of these people might hear you and kill you. So here we see, again, that it's somewhat ironic that this entire story started with Micah stealing from his mother, only to have his things stolen from him. And the Danites took it all with them and left him with none of his household gods or idols or his household priests. And he felt like he couldn't fight the Danites because there were too many of them, so he ended up going back home. And that's actually the last we hear of Micah. But the story goes on. It says, "But the people of Dan took what Micah had made and the priests who belonged to him, and they came to Laish and the people to a people quiet and unsuspecting, and struck them with the edge of the sword and burned the city with fire. And there was no deliverer because it was far from Sidon. They had no dealings with anyone. It was in the valley that belongs to Beth Rehob, and they rebuilt the city and lived in it. They named the city Dan after the name Dan, their ancestor, who was born in Israel, but the name of the city was Laish at the first. And the people of Dan set up the carved image for themselves, and Jonathan, the son of Gershom, the son of Moses, and his sons were priests to the tribe of the Danites until the day of the captivity of the land. And so they set up Micah's carved image that he had made as long as the house of God was in Shiloh." Okay, so we see here that Dan, in some ways, you could say they're successful. They conquered the city. It's interesting that they strike them, and it said they were a quiet and unsuspecting people, and they just kind of wiped them out. It doesn't seem like there was necessarily even much of a battle. It was more of a massacre. And then they rebuild the city and rename it, and then it says here that the priest, Jonathan, the son, they finally name him Jonathan, the son of Gershom, son of Moses. Whether he's the grandson of Moses or a descendant of Moses is a little unclear. But what we see here is that they're setting up these images, this idol, and this false priesthood, really. And this false priesthood actually lasts for a very long time. And it's kind of a sad story. You read this and you're like, what's going on? The first, Micah betrays his mother, repents, and then he sets up his idols. Things seem to be going well, and then things are stolen from him, and then the Danites go, and what we see here is a huge lack of God doing anything, right? This entire time, we see that, it seems like God's not moving at all. But I think this is kind of where we want to take a step back and look at this whole story in context. And remember, what's stated several times is that in those days there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And the thing is, I think it's easy to look at this and be like, wow, we would never do something like that. But I think at the heart of this story is really the idea of false religion. And people trying to worship God, but trying to do it in their own way. And while we don't set up idols ourselves, I think this is easy for us to do as well. It's easy for us to try to go about and worship God as we think is best. And this is what Micah did, and this is what the Danites did. And it does have disastrous consequences later, because eventually it talks about, until the day that they went into the captivity. Eventually, God is going to allow punishment to come and conquer the Danites and take them away as captive, because sin will not go unpunished forever, even though God is being merciful and delaying that punishment. And kind of looking at our own lives, I think it's important for us to realize, it's easy for us to set up things to be like, if I do this, I'm following God. And this is what Micah thought. If I have a Levite, then that means I'm following God and he's going to bless me. And we think, well, if I go to church, that means I'm following God and he's going to bless me. Or if I give money, it means I'm following God and he's going to bless me. Or show up to Wednesday evenings, right? Or all these other things, or even volunteer. And I think it's important that we are called not to just do certain things, but to really give ourselves up to God and come to him and say, I don't want to do what I think is best. I want to do what you think is best. And I think this is something that it's really easy for even us as believers to lose sight of, to think, to try to figure things out on our own instead of, I'm not just going to do things because I think it's good or bad. I'm going to do things because this is who God calls me to be. And this is, I think, what Israel was really missing. And over again, we see this in the book of Judges. Okay, well, we're going to continue because we have quite a bit left still. We are going to try to finish the book of Judges today. So our first story was about Micah and the Danites and his priests. And now the second one is going to be about another Levite. And it's going to have another series of disasters and bad things happen that, in many ways, I think is even worse than this previous story. And it says, in those days, in chapter 19, in those days, when there was no king in Israel, again, hearkening back to everyone was doing what was right in his own eyes, when there was no king in Israel, a certain Levite was sojourning in the remote parts of the hill country of Ephraim, who took to himself a concubine from Bethlehem in Judah. And his concubine was unfaithful to him, and she went away from him to her father's house at Bethlehem in Judah, and was there for some 4 months. Okay, so we see here already some interesting things. The fact that he took her as a concubine is interesting, because why was she a concubine? Is in many ways kind of like a second-class wife. So part of the question is, why wasn't she just a wife? Remember, even back at the very beginning, God was very clear. You're supposed to have one man and one woman together in marriage, and the two are supposed to become one flesh. So this is already a deviation from God's plan. And then it says the concubine was unfaithful to him. We're not sure exactly what that means, but for whatever reason, she left and went back home to her father and was there for a while. And we don't know why she stayed there for 4 months, if he was waiting for her to come back or if he didn't really even think about it. But then in verse 3 it continues and said, then her husband arose and went after her to speak kindly to her and bring her back. He had with him his servant and a couple of donkeys, and she brought him into her house. And when the girl's father saw him, he came out with joy to meet him. And his father-in-law, the girl's father, made him stay, and he remained with him 3 days. And so they ate and drank and spent the night there. So at first we see almost a happy reunion. Things come together. Things seem to be going well. And her husband arose and he wanted to speak kindly to her to really restore the relationship, which in some ways is good, right? Seems like a promising turn of events. And the father and assumedly the concubine were happy to even see him. So again, this is starting off on a positive note, and they're eating and drinking together. It says, and on the 4th day they arose early in the morning, and he prepared to go. But the girl's father said to his son-in-law, gather your he said to his son-in-law, strengthen your heart with a morsel of bread, and after that you may go. And so the two of them sat and ate and drank together. And the girl's father said to the man, be pleased to spend the night and let your heart be merry. And when the man rose up to go, his father-in-law pressed him till he spent the night there again. And on the 5th day he rose again early in the morning to depart. And the girl's father said, strengthen your heart and wait until the day declines. So they ate, both of them. When the man ate, a man and his concubine and his servant rose up to depart. His father-in-law, the girl's father, said to him, behold, now the day has waned towards evening. Please spend the night. Behold, the day draws to its close. Lodge here, and let your heart be merry. And tomorrow you shall arise early in the morning for your journey, and go home. But the man would not spend the night, and he rose up and departed, and arrived opposite Jebus, that is Jerusalem. And he had with him a couple of saddled donkeys, and his concubine was with him. So we see here kind of an interesting tale. So this father-in-law was being very hospitable, and we don't know why he seemed to want this guy to stay forever. But we get this interesting situation where this man, this Levi, he's really eager to leave, but the father-in-law keeps enticing him to stay longer and longer. And eventually, on the 5th day, he's had enough, and he decides he's going to leave even though it's late in the day. And he says, you know what, I'm going to leave anyway. So he gets to the city, and it says, when they were near Jebus, the day was nearly over, and the servant said to his master, come now, let us turn aside to this city of the Jebusites and spend the night in it. And his master said to him, we will not turn aside into the city of foreigners who do not belong to the people of Israel, but we will pass on to Gibeah. And he said to his young man, come and let us draw near to one of these places and spend the night at Gibeah or at Ramah. And so they passed on and went their way, and the sun went down on them near Gibeah, which belongs to Benjamin, and they turned aside there to go in and spend the night at Gibeah. And he went in and sat on the open square of the city, for no one took them into their house to spend the night. Okay, so hospitality is a huge thing here in this culture, and so they go to this city Jebus, and the servant says, "Let's just go and stop there." He says, "No, they're not of the people of Israel. They're far Jebusites." And so he says, "Well, let's not go there. Let's press on to an Israelite city, and be there." And so they do. They press on to Gibeah, which is a Benjaminite city, and they go into the open square. And at first, they don't find anybody to be hospitable to them, which is unusual because normally, in that time, if you were a foreigner or somebody just entering into the city, whether or not you were an Israelite, it was very much expected for the people of the city to host you because it can be dangerous. But they don't have that, and so they go into the open square of the city. And then finally it says, "And behold, an old man was coming from his work in the field that evening. The man was from the hill country of Ephraim, and he was sojourning at Gibeah. And the men of the place were Benjaminites. And he lifted up his eyes and saw the traveler in the open square of the city. And the old man said, Where are you going? And where do you come from? And he said to him, We are passing from Bethlehem to Judah, to the remote parts of the hill country of Ephraim, from which I came. I went to Bethlehem in Judah, and now I'm going to the house of the Lord. But no one has taken me into his house. We have straw and feed for our donkeys, with bread and wine for me and your female servant, and the young man with your servants. There is no lack of anything. And the old man said, Peace be to you. I will care for you for all your wants, only do not spend the night in the square. So he brought him into his house and gave the donkey feed, and they washed their feet and ate and drank. So we see here a man who's kind of a foreigner to this town. He's from the hill country of Ephraim, like the Levite is, and he says, Here, come into my house. And he says, Only do not spend the night in the square, kind of some foreshadowing that he knows that bad things are going on at night in this town. And so they take him into his house, they wash their feet, they get comfortable, they eat, and they drink. And as they were making their hearts merry, behold, the men of the city, worthless fellows, surrounded the house, beating on the door. And they said to the old man, the master of the house, Bring out the man who came into your home, that we may know him. And the man, the master of the house, went out to them and said, No, my brothers, do not act so wickedly, since this man has come into my house. Do not do this vile thing. Behold, here are my virgin daughter and his concubine. Let me bring them out now, violate them, and do with them what seems good to you. But against this man do not do this outrageous thing. But the men would not listen to him. So the man seized his concubine and made her go out to them. And they knew her and abused her all night long until the morning. And as the dawn began to break, they let her go. And as the morning appeared, the woman came and fell down at the door of the man's house where her master was until it was light. So we had this really awful description of things that go on. So the men of the city surround the house and say, basically, bring out the man, we want to rape him, is what they say, which is awful, but this is what's going on. And it's interesting here because a few things happen. So the man says, No, don't rape this guy. Instead, here's my daughter and his concubine, which seems equally awful, but for some reason he felt compelled to protect the main guest of his household, which was the man at this time, and he was willing to throw his daughter and the concubine under the bus. And they don't want to listen to him, and so instead the Levite, it seems to be the Levite, takes his concubine and basically throws her to the wolves, and he throws her outside, and they repeatedly rape her. They in a group, and it's a really awful day. It says they abuse her into the morning, and she's able to kind of crawl back to the door of this man's house in the morning. Now there's an important parallel going on here. If this seems familiar to you, even outside of this passage, just because it's a very similar situation to what happened in Sodom and Gomorrah way back in Genesis with Lot. Because remember, God said, I'm going to go destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, and Abraham pleads for it and says, what if there are righteous people there? And he bargains with God, and God says, if there are 10 righteous people there, I'll spare the city. And so the angels go into Sodom and Gomorrah, and Lot invites them in, and it's a very similar situation where the people surround Lot's house, and they say, Give us these men, we want to rape them. And Lot says, Well, I'll give you my daughters instead. And then but the difference is the angels are there. It's not just a Levite, and the angels strike the people of Sodom with blindness, and then they get Lot and his family out, and then fire and brimstone fall on Sodom and Gomorrah and utterly destroy them. Now, the interesting thing is here, It's the people of Israel, God's chosen people, who are literally doing the very same thing. And it's even worse because it's allowed to play out. In fact, the concubine is thrown out to them, and they gangbang her, which is just incredibly awful. And it's really graphic descriptions of what happened. And there's no angels to stop it. And in fact, we see the callousness of the Levite in this next scene. And it says, "And her master rose up in the morning, and we opened the door of the house, and he went out to go on his way. Behold, there was his concubine lying at the door of his house with her hands on the threshold. And he said to her, 'Get up, let's be going.' But there was no answer. Then he put her on the donkey, and the man rose up and went on his way to his home." So we see here this guy opens the door and sees his concubine, presumably dead, at the doorstep, and he says, "Get up, let's go." But she doesn't get up, and so he puts her on the donkey and leaves. We see he seems very callous here. That he wasn't looking to save her. He was just kind of letting this all play out. And it's interesting that he went to go out, and on his way, he went to go home, not to find his concubine at this point. Which is, I think, very telling. And then when he gets home, it says, "When he entered his house, he took a knife, and taking hold of his concubine, he divided her limb by limb into 12 pieces, and sent her throughout all the territory of Israel. And all who saw it said, 'Such a thing has never happened or has been seen from the day that the people of Israel came up from the land of Egypt until this day. Consider it, take counsel, and speak.'" So again, we see it's a very gruesome turn of events here that is going on. So he literally cuts her up and sends her out to Israel as kind of a rallying cry. Now, I think this is really important, that when we look at this, we see just some really graphic and awful stuff going on. But I think this is showing that the people of Israel are so morally degraded that they have become like the very worst of the people around them. And God allowed Canaan to be destroyed because they were doing things like this. Yet Israel has done the very same thing. And even in some ways, you could say the good guy, the Levite, is not really a good guy at all. In fact, he seems just as callous and selfish. And the host's willingness to really throw out the women of his household to the wolves, it's just showing a complete lack of any sort of morality that's in line with who God is. And it really deteriorates things significantly. Yeah, and it shows, patriarchy at the worst, right? The men are trying to protect themselves at the expense of the women, and they view them as really property. And again, this is not to say this is how it should be. None of this is remotely how God intends things for me. Even when it talks about men being in charge, it's in order to serve women and protect those who are weak and downtrodden, yet instead they're protecting themselves. So we see here really a reversal of the way God has intended society to be, and it's going to cause some pretty severe ramifications. And it says, well, we're going to go ahead and I'm going to read all of chapter 20 because we got a lot going on, and I do want to keep this in a timely manner. So in chapter 20 is really all about the Israelite response to this tragedy. And then all the people of Israel came out from Dan to Beersheba, including the land of Gilead, and the congregation assembled as one man to the Lord at Mizpah. And the chiefs of all the people and all the tribes of Israel presented themselves in the assembly of God, 400,000 men on foot that drew the sword. Now the people of Benjamin heard that the people of Israel had gone up to Mizpah. And the people of Israel said, "Tell us, how did this evil happen?" And the Levite, the husband of the woman who was murdered, answered and said, "I came to Gibeah that belongs to Benjamin, I and my concubine, to spend the night. And the leaders of Gibeah rose against me and surrounded the house against me by night. They meant to kill me, and they violated my concubine, and she is dead. And so I took my concubine and cut her up into pieces and sent her throughout all the country to the inheritance of Israel, for they had committed abomination and outrage in Israel. Behold, you people of Israel, all you, give your advice and counsel here." And all the people arose as one man, saying, "None of us will go to his tent, and none of us will return to his house. But now this is what we will do to Gibeah. We will go up against it by lot, and we will take 10 men of 100 throughout all the tribes of Israel, and 100 of 1,000, and 1,000 of 10,000, and bring provisions for the people, that they may come and may repay Gibeah of Benjamin for all the outrage that they have committed in Israel. And so the men of Israel gathered against the city, united as one man. And the tribes of Israel sent men throughout all the tribe of Benjamin, saying, What evil is this that has taken place among you? Now therefore give up the men, the worthless fellows in Gibeah, that we may put them to death and purge evil from Israel. And the Benjaminites would not listen to the voice of their brothers, the people of Israel. And then the people of Benjamin came together out of the cities of Gibeah to go out to battle against the people of Israel. And the people of Benjamin mustered out of their cities on that day 26,000 men who drew the sword, besides the inhabitants of Gibeah, who mustered 700 chosen men. Along with these were 700 chosen men who were left-handed. Everyone could sling a stone at a hair and not miss. And the men of Israel, apart from Benjamin, mustered 400,000 men who drew the sword. All these were men of war. The people of Israel arose and went up to Bethel and inquired of God, Who shall go up first to fight against the people of Benjamin? And the Lord said, Judah shall go up first. Then the people of Israel rose in the morning and encamped against Gibeah. And the men of Israel went out to fight against Benjamin. And the men of Israel drew up the battle line against them at Gibeah. And the people of Benjamin came out of Gibeah and destroyed on that day 22,000 men of the Israelites. But the people of the men of Israel took courage and again formed in battle lines in the very same place where they had formed it on the first day. And the people of Israel went up and wept before the Lord until evening. And they inquired of the Lord, Shall we again draw near to fight against our brothers, the people of Benjamin? And the Lord said, Go up against them. So the people of Israel came near against the people of Benjamin the second day, and Benjamin went against them out of Gibeah the second day and destroyed 18,000 men of the people of Israel. All these were men who drew the sword, and all the people of Israel, the whole army, went up and came to Bethel and wept. They sat there before the Lord and fasted that day until evening, and offered burnt offerings and peace offerings before the Lord. And the people of Israel inquired of the Lord, for the ark of the covenant of God was there in those days. And Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, son of Aaron, ministered before it in those days, saying, Shall we go out once more to battle against our brothers, the people of Benjamin, or shall we cease? And the Lord said, Go up, for tomorrow I will give them into your hand. So Israel set men in ambush around Gibeah, and the people of Israel went up against the people of Benjamin on the third day, and set themselves in array against Gibeah, as at other times. And the people of Benjamin went out against the people, and were drawn away from the city. And as at other times, they began to strike and kill some of the people in the highways, one of which goes up to Bethel, and the other to Gibeah. And in the open country, about 30 men of Israel. And the people of Benjamin said, They are routed before us as the first. But the people of Israel said, Let us flee and draw them away from the city to the highways. And all the men of Israel rose up out of their place and set themselves in the array at Baal Tamar. And the men of Israel who were in ambush rushed out of their place from Mirah Gibeah, and there came against Gibeah 10,000 chosen men of all Israel, and the battle was hard. But the Benjaminites did not know that disaster was close upon them. And the Lord defeated Benjamin before Israel, and the people of Israel destroyed 25,100 men of Benjamin that day. All these were men who drew the sword. So the people of Benjamin saw that they were defeated. The men of Israel gave ground to Benjamin because they trusted the men in ambush whom they had sent against Gibeah. Then the men in ambush hurried and rushed against Gibeah. The men in ambush moved out and struck all the city with the edge of the sword. Now the appointed signal between the men of Israel and the men of the main ambush was that when they made a great cloud of smoke rise up out of the city, the men of Israel should turn in battle. Now Benjamin had begun to strike and kill about 30 men of Israel. They said, Surely they are defeated before us as in the first battle. But when the signal had began to rise out of the city, and a column of smoke, the Benjaminites looked behind them, and behold, the whole of the city went up in smoke to heaven. And then the men of Israel turned, and the men of Benjamin were dismayed, for they saw that disaster was close upon them. Therefore they turned their backs before the men of Israel in the direction of the wilderness, but the battle overtook them. And those who came out of the cities were destroying them in their midst. Surrounding the Benjaminites, they pursued them and trod them from Nohah as far as the opposite of Gibeah on the east. 18,000 men of Benjamin fell, all of them men of valor, and they returned and fled to the wilderness and to the rock of Rimmon. 5,000 men of them were cut down and in the highways, and they were pursued hard to Gidom and 2,000 men of them were struck down. So all who fell that day of Benjamin were 25,000 men who drew the sword, all of them men of valor. But 600 men turned and fled towards the wilderness on the rock of Rimmon and remained at the rock of Rimmon 4 months. And the men of Israel turned back against the people of Benjamin and struck them with the edge of the sword, the city, men and beasts, and all that they had found, and all the towns they had found they set on fire. Okay, that was a lot going on. But briefly, let's recap. So there's this. The war is basically all of Israel is united together. Now, this is really unusual in the book of Judges because normally Israel is fragmented, as we've seen over and over again in Judges. None of the judges were able to muster this big of a force together. But it's happening here, but it's very sad, right? Because it's happening in civil war. And so they go out and they go against their brothers. And it does say that eventually the Lord gives them victory. And so they defeat Benjamin. But then some interesting things happen in that they start not just defeating them, but they slaughter them. They kill all the fighting men. And then they go back and they kill all their towns, all their kids, and all their women. And so the only people of the tribe of Benjamin that are left are the 600 men that are hiding at this rock of Rimmon. Okay, so let's go ahead and finish out our story because we have one chapter left, and then we'll kind of recap and talk about it a little bit. And it says in chapter 21, Now the men of Israel had sworn to Mizpah, Not one of us shall give his daughter in marriage to Benjamin. And the people came to Bethel and sat there till evening before God, and they lifted up their voices and wept bitterly. And they said, O Lord, the God of Israel, why has this happened in Israel, that today there should be one tribe lacking in Israel? And the next day the people rose early and built there an altar and offered burnt offerings and peace offerings. And the people of Israel said, Which of all the tribes of Israel did not come up in the assembly to the Lord? For they had taken a great oath concerning him who did not come up to the Lord to Mizpah, saying, He shall surely be put to death. And the people of Israel had compassion for Benjamin their brother, and said, One tribe is cut off from Israel this day. What shall we do for those who are left, since we have sworn by the Lord that we will not give them any of our daughters for wives? Okay, so what we see here is that Israel is basically saying they're lamenting the loss of one of their tribes. They can't even imagine themselves without the 12 tribes of Israel. So they're saying, what should we do? Because almost all of Benjamin has been wiped out, and we made this vow not to give our daughters as wives to the Benjaminites. Now you might be asking, why did they do this? And the answer is, we're not really sure, except that everyone did what was right in their own eyes, right? So I think they were right to go to war against Benjamin to punish him for this heinous sin. It seems to be that the Lord was with them in that battle, but they seem to have taken it way too far in terms of slaughtering all the people of the tribe of Benjamin. And now they're trying to make up for this, which, again, God seems to be oddly silent in this chapter here, that God doesn't tell them what to do. Instead, they're trying to figure out a way to get around their oath. And so they say, what tribe didn't come up to help us in this battle? And they said, what one is there of the tribes of Israel that did not come up to the Lord to Mizpah? And behold, no one had come up from the camp of Jabesh Gilead to the assembly. For when the people were mustered, behold, not one of the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead was there. And so the congregation sent 12,000 of their bravest men there and commanded them, Go and strike the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead with the edge of the sword, also the women and the little ones. This is what you shall do. Every male and every woman that has laid with a male you shall devote to destruction. And they found among the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead 400 young virgins who had not known a man by laying with him. And they brought them to the camp of Shiloh, which was in the land of Canaan. And the whole congregation sent word to the people of Benjamin who were at the rock of Rimmon, and proclaimed peace to them. And Benjamin returned at that time, and they gave them the woman who they had saved alive, the woman of Jabesh Gilead, but they were not enough for them. And the people had compassion on Benjamin, because the Lord had made a breach in the tribes of Israel. So we see here, and they go and basically massacre this tribe who didn't come up to help them in the battle with the Benjaminites, and give all the young women who were virgins to the remnants of the tribe of Benjamin they had just been fighting. And Yeah, so this whole thing, they didn't seem to inquire why the people of Jabesh Gilead did not come up, but they just wholesale slaughtered them as well. They thought, this might be a solution to our problem, but there are still not enough women here. It says, then the elders of the congregation said, what should we do for wives for those who are left, since women are destroyed out of Benjamin? And they said, there must be an inheritance for the survivors of Benjamin, that a tribe not be blotted out from Israel. Yet we cannot give them wives from our daughters, for the people of Israel had sworn, cursed be he who gives a wife to Benjamin. So they said, behold, there is the yearly feast of the Lord at Shiloh, which is north of Bethel, on the east of the highway that goes up from Bethel to Shechem, and south of Lebanoah. And they commanded the people of Benjamin, saying, go and lie in ambush in the vineyards and watch. If the daughters of Shiloh come out to dance in the dances, then come out of the vineyards and snatch each man his wife from the daughters of Shiloh and go to the land of Benjamin. And when the fathers or their brothers come and complain to us, we will say to him, grant them graciously to us, because we did not take for each man of them his wife in battle, neither did you give them to them, else you would now be guilty. And the people of Benjamin did so, and took their wives according to their number from the dancers whom they carried off. Then they went and returned to their inheritance, rebuilt the towns, and lived in them. And the people of Israel departed from there at that time, every man to his tribe and family, and went out from there, every man to his inheritance. In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Okay, so we finally got to the end here, and it's really a horrible ending, right? So basically, not only did they loot a bunch of women and give to the tribe of Benjamin, now they said, okay, tribe of Benjamin, you can go out, and when these women come out to dance, you can basically go and kidnap them and steal them for your wives. And it's okay, because it's technically getting around the curse to say you're not allowed to give wives to people of Benjamin. And it's really a tragedy that at the beginning of this story, a horrible example of really rape and it was turned into, at the end of this story, at least 200 women were abducted and raped as well, seemingly against their will. So we see a lesser evil, a great evil turns into an even greater evil at the end of this. And so it's easy to look at this and say, what in the world is going on? And there are a few things that I want to encourage you to take away from this. This story of really horrors, and it's like, why did God include this in the Bible? And I think one thing that's really important in this is that the Bible doesn't shy away from reality. And the Bible very clearly doesn't record everything that happens in ancient Israel or in history. But it includes a lot of stuff, and a lot of stuff that we wouldn't necessarily even expect. Like these passages in here, they're really dark, and they show really the depravity of the nation of Israel. But I think it's important because when we look around us in the world today, and when we look at our own lives, a lot of times we are faced with darkness that is just really bleak. We see people raping each other, and we see people killing each other, and we see people propose solutions that are worse than the problems that they're trying to solve. And over again, we just see such horrors in the world. And I think in some ways it's encouraging to me that you see the horrors in the Bible too, that the Bible has some really dark stuff, and these chapters really exemplify that. But even in the midst of these, one thing we remember is that God is still moving. And that even though all this bad stuff is happening, this is not the end of the story. It's all pointing to a greater judge that's going to come and set things right in Jesus. And the other thing I think is important, it says, in those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. This idea of no king, some people think, well, that's pointing toward the fact that a king should come and correct all this awful behavior. And there's some truth to that, but I think there's a bigger truth here as well, that, when the kings came, things were no better. If you look at Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles, things just keep getting worse. And even though there are some good kings that try to point things in the right direction, it's really not any better. And I think one of the ways to interpret this is, in those days there was no king in Israel, saying that people didn't even need a king to mislead them. They were misleading themselves. And I think that there's truth in that we mislead ourselves. Unless we surrender our will to God's will and to his plan, we're always going to be misled. And the second thing is the idea of no king, is that ultimately who should be our king? because it was never an earthly king that we were looking for. It's a heavenly king, and that's Jesus and the Father. And that's what I think the people of Israel miss, and that we often miss too, is that the Lord is our king, and he's ultimately the one that we need to be looking to. Because if we're trying to trust in our own judgment for how things are going, it's just going to get really bad, and our lives are just going to be a series of mistakes. And a lot of times when we come up with, when there's a difficult situation, we try to come up with a solution that ends up worse than the original difficult situation. I think that's what we see here. We see a bunch of people fumbling around trying to solve these awful problems, and their solutions are worse at the end than they were at the beginning. And so I think the same thing is true in our lives. When we keep trying to solve our own problems with our own solutions, we're just going to get worse and worse and further away from God's will for our life, which is why we're called to surrender our lives to Jesus and say, you know what? I don't always understand everything God commands me to do and understand it, but ultimately I'm going to seek after the kind of life that God is calling me to. Instead of doing what is right in my own eyes, I'm going to give that to Him and do what He wants me to do. Because I think that's the truth of Judges is twofold, that when we surrender our lives to Jesus, He will bless us and He will cause us to draw closer to Him. And then ultimately, that even when we fail to do that, when we fall on our face, and when we get into bleak times, like often is in the book of Judges, that doesn't mean God's will is thwarted, and that even in the worst of times, He's going to be with us, and He's going to carry out His will in the world and in our lives. And He showed that in Jesus. You know, even in the very worst of all situations, is that Jesus took that punishment on Himself, and on the cross He paid the price for even these horrible things that we see here. And that gives us peace, so that when we go through those dark things, we can turn to Him and know that we have hope, and that even though He often delays His punishment, that doesn't mean there won't be a reckoning, and their justice will prevail in the end. And when we trust ourselves in Him, we can experience His mercy as well. That it's not based on our good behavior, but based on His grace. Because ultimately, Judges isn't about the people. It's about the gracious God who's working in the middle of it. So that's my encouragement for you. Sorry I couldn't be here in person, and we couldn't have more of a dialogue and question and answer, but if anybody wants to talk to me about any of this, I'd love to talk with you individually. Anyways, I hope you have a good rest of your evening, and hopefully I'll see you on Sunday.